This lecture is about Krashen's theories of language acquisition. There are 5 theories that he put forward: acquisition and learning hypothesis, monitor hypothesis, natural order, input hypothesis, and the affective filter hypothesis. Let's look at each one individually. Acquisition versus learning. Learning is explicit instruction, or consciously studying a language, and acquisition, subconsciously absorbing language as you use it for a variety of purposes. This is a continuation of the controversy that we had last term. Let's take a look at what historical background of language learning led up to Krashen's theories. From the 17th to the 19th century, language learning was really focused on grammar translation, and this was based on the learning that was coming out of translating Greek and Latin. As we move forward in the 20th century, focus became audiolingual method for teaching. Audiolingual was very focused on memorization of dialogues and of a particular vocabulary. It was not very intuitive, and it was coming from B.F. Skinner's concept that learners learn by repetition. And Krashen moved this concept forward in the 1970s by saying, really, we don't learn by repetition. That creates a prescribed and inauthentic method of learning a language. He thought that language was meant for communication, which it is, and that therefore we learn it more in the same way that we learn our first language. As we think forward, Krashen's theories are important, but they are not the only ones now. And we look into the 2000s, and we see from last term the National Reading Panel and their concepts of how we learn, and also an article by Susan Dutro and many others as well, where they believe that we weave concrete instruction with content area teaching. That is, explicit language instruction is needed to learn academic language. With simple everyday language, or BICS, perhaps we can acquire it without any instruction, but academic language in particular needs to have specific instruction. Krashen believes that acquisition is the main player in fluency, and when we have a monitor or an internal editor that is trying to correct our language learning, we will actually not speak as well or communicate as clearly. That learning functions as that monitor, that piece that says, oh, that doesn't sound right. There are some problems with this, using a monitor, and as he states, there are 3 necessary conditions for it. First of all is time. Using a monitor requires time. We have to be able to stop and think about the rule in our head and then apply it, which of course is going to stop the flow of communication. Also, you need to focus on form. So you're focusing instead of the communication, you're focusing on how did I say that? And of course, you need to know the rules. And those rules need to be embedded in your mind. But often, it slows us down as we stop to think about the rule, and it causes us to break the communication process. The natural order hypothesis. Krashen believes that grammar structures are acquired in somewhat of a predictable order, but it's not something that can be exactly figured out, and therefore you can't determine what to teach in grammar. There's no sequence that's useful. You need to just acquire it as it comes up in natural communication. He believes that second language learners learn in an order different from first language learners, and that second language learning adults and children show a pretty similar order of what they learn. And rules are easiest to state, not necessarily are the first acquired. For example, the learning and teaching of the article a and the, not difficult to teach to someone, but it's often difficult for students to learn it and be able to actually use it. The input hypothesis. He believes that comprehensible input, that is a message that students can understand, is a must. You can't have acquisition without comprehensible input. Here's the ideas behind this. Input must be slightly above the student's current level. That is I+1, input +1. There is a problem with this in that he cannot define what is I plus 1. How do you figure out what is just above a language learner's ability? And then that students learn at different rates and at different levels. I think we all understand that that must be true because we have students all across the board in the classroom, which means that we have to have differentiated instruction to be able to meet everybody's needs. In order to make comprehensible input, we need to think about different ways that can be done. We can use pictures, gestures, recycling the vocabulary in more and more units, repetition. These are just a few ideas of how to make comprehensible input. The affective filter hypothesis. There are certain conditions that are necessary for acquiring a language. As emotional human beings, we have all kinds of investment or lack of investment in learning something new. So we need to consider the motivation. Are students motivated to learn a language? What is it they want to do with the language? That's going to affect their affective filter. Self-confidence. Everyone has their own personality, and some people have more confidence than others. And certainly we impact their confidence as well. This will have an effect on their affective filter, their emotions about learning. And finally, the low anxiety is an important piece to the teacher. The teacher needs to be the one who's creating a low anxiety classroom where there is not sense that they are going to be bullied or have any sense of fear. Too high of a filter prevents input from being used for acquisition. So let's take a look at what can help create an effective classroom with a low affective filter. Here's a quote from Henry Ford: "Whether you think you can or think you can't, you are right." So a high affective filter, which is something we do not want in a classroom, this comes about when the teacher overemphasizes correctness, when the teacher is saying, "That's not right," and is always redirecting students to do something correctly. That creates anxiety in a student and raises the affective filter. If there's laughing at mistakes is tolerated. If the teacher lets that go on, then students will not feel comfortable being able to speak or use the language they do have, and that will create a higher affective filter. If the teacher puts students in embarrassing situations, if they force them to answer, then a student is going to often clam up and not want to speak at all. Another important thing that we maybe don't think as related to the affective filter is having no routines. Routines help students feel safe. They know what to expect and what to do. And it can raise the affective filter if there are no routines. Now let's look at the positive side. How do we lower the affective filter in a classroom? When errors are natural and we affirm a student's efforts, we can help lower their affective filter. Instead of saying, "That's not right," when we say, "Oh, you made a really good effort. Let's look at what we might do to fix that." We can lower that affective filter. When respect is required by all, and there is zero tolerance of disrespect, and a very important piece in any classroom, it's true for all of the students, not just for our second language learners. Another way to lower the affective filter is using pair work and group work, using a sense of think, pair, share. Then as a second language learner, I have an opportunity to learn from my group or my partner and to help me understand if I really get the concept before I'm having to speak in front of the whole class. And then setting very clear routines so that students have that sense of comfort in the classroom. So Stephen Krashen said on second language acquisition, "We acquire a language in one way and only one way, when we get comprehensible input in a low anxiety environment." Think about this concept and what are ways that you, as a future teacher, can have comprehensible input with low anxiety environment. Let's take a look now in a nutshell at his theories and his ideas. So comprehensible input is where we begin. With comprehensible input, that is a real piece of the teacher. What have you done in your lesson to help students be able to understand. If your lesson is made up just of words, you're like a talking head and they're not going to understand. You need to give pictures, maybe even a pantomime or a little video, different ways for students to be able to understand what you're saying and doing. Then we need to think about the affective filter. What have I done to help create a comfortable classroom? Am I giving students an opportunity to share with each other, to learn from each other? Or am I raising that affective filter? Have I created a barrier between learning because students feel afraid or nervous? Have I created a sense of safety so that students won't feel that they are bullied or embarrassed or ridiculed? I need to think about these pieces of the affective filter. If I've done a good job of comprehensible input, if I have lowered the affective filter, then information can get into the LAD, or language acquisition device, as Chomsky said. This means that I have acquired the knowledge. And this is where we want to have students be, that they have actually learned or acquired has become a part of them. Up here we have learned knowledge. This is things that we actually teach. And this is what helps function using our monitor. So when we think about something we're going to say or write, then our learned knowledge is using our monitor to check ourselves. Is it correct? Did I do it right? And finally, we get the output. Something to think about is how much is it just acquired and how much do we actually need to teach that is learned knowledge. These are pieces to think about for yourself and to consider into the future as you become the teacher in the classroom.